At 5:08 p.m. on the 9th of June 1953, a funnel cloud descended from a dark, low ceiling of clouds over the town of Holden in central Massachusetts. It was not yet a tornado. It was a rotating column of air that had not made contact with the ground. Meteorologists at the Weather Bureau office in Boston had been watching the conditions all afternoon. There was a cold front pushing east from the Great Lakes and a warm, humid air mass sitting over New England. The ingredients were there. At 5:08 the touchdown happened. The funnel touched the ground and within seconds it was doing damage. Trees snapped, roofs lifted. The tornado was on the ground. It moved northeast at about 30 miles per hour. At 5:12 it entered the town of West Boylston. Here the damage became severe. Houses were flattened, cars were thrown. People who saw it described a wall of black debris, not a classic funnel. The tornado was rain-wrapped. It was nearly invisible until it was on top of you. At 5:20, the tornado crossed into the city of Worcester. Worcester in 1953 was a manufacturing city of over 200,000 people. It had mills, factories, churches, and dense neighborhoods of single-family homes. The tornado struck the Assumption College campus, then moved through the residential streets of the Greendale neighborhood. It was now a violent tornado moving at high speed, nearly a mile wide in some areas. At 5:25, it crossed Lake Quinsigamond. Boats were capsized, waves were thrown. The tornado was unstoppable. At 5:30, the tornado struck the downtown area of Worcester. It hit the Worcester Telegram and Gazette building. It hit the downtown department stores. Debris clogged the streets. At 5:35, it passed over the grounds of the Worcester State Hospital, a massive psychiatric facility. The hospital was crowded with patients. The tornado ripped off the roofs of several wards. Dozens were killed inside. At 5:40, the tornado continued into the suburb of Shrewsbury. Here it began to weaken. By 5:45, the funnel lifted. The total time on the ground was about 1 hour and 20 minutes. The path was 46 miles long. The death toll would reach 94 people. Over 1,300 were injured. More than 4,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. What happened in Worcester on that June evening was the deadliest tornado in New England history. It is still the deadliest. But the story of the Worcester tornado is not only about the damage path. It is about what came before the storm and what came after. It is about a warning system that was still in its infancy. It is about a public that did not understand the danger. And it is about a moment when the Weather Bureau, as it was then called, made a decision to try something new. The afternoon of June 9, 1953 was hot and humid. By early afternoon, thunderstorms were developing over western Massachusetts. The Weather Bureau's forecast center in Washington, D.C. had issued a general forecast for severe thunderstorms in the region, but there was no such thing as a tornado warning at that time. The word tornado was avoided in public forecasts. There was a fear of causing panic. There was also a lack of knowledge about how to predict them. The Weather Bureau had only begun issuing tornado forecasts experimentally the previous year, 1952. The system was based on observations of certain atmospheric patterns. It was crude by modern standards. It relied on telephone calls, teletype messages, and handwritten notes. At 3:45 p.m. on June 9th, a forecaster in Boston noticed that the conditions were aligning for a tornado. He called the Washington office. They agreed. At 4 p.m., the Boston office issued a bulletin to the public. It read in part, thunderstorms with damaging winds and possibly a tornado are expected in central Massachusetts late this afternoon. That was the warning. It was sent to newspapers, radio stations, and police departments. But how many people heard it? In Worcester, the radio stations did break into regular programming. Some people heard the announcement, many did not. Factories were still running. Children were walking home from school. People were cooking dinner. The warning was vague. It said possibly a tornado. There had never been a tornado like this in Massachusetts. Most people assumed it would be a bad thunderstorm. At 4:30 p.m., the Weather Bureau in Boston watched the radar. They had a primitive radar set. They saw a hook echo forming. They knew what it meant. They tried to get additional warnings out, but there was no way to reach individual towns quickly. The telephone lines were busy. The teletype machines were slow. At 5 p.m., the tornado was on the ground. The first reports of damage came in at 5:10. A police officer in Holden called the state police. A fire department in West Boylston reported debris. But by the time the information reached emergency managers, the tornado was already moving through populated areas. The first responders were caught off guard. Police officers drove into the storm areas without knowing where the tornado was. Ambulances could not move because roads were blocked. Hospitals were overwhelmed. The Worcester City Hospital had to set up triage in the hallways. The National Guard was called in. The Red Cross mobilized. But the scale of the destruction was something New England had never seen. Whole blocks of homes were reduced to rubble. Cars were wrapped around trees. Bodies were found in fields and under collapsed walls. The search for survivors continued through the night. In the days that followed, investigators from the Weather Bureau arrived. They mapped the damage path. They interviewed witnesses. They studied the atmospheric data. What they found was that the tornado had been produced by a supercell thunderstorm. It had developed rapidly. The hook echo was clear on radar. The forecasters had seen it, but the warning system was not capable of reaching people in time. The public did not understand what a tornado warning meant. Many people who heard the bulletin thought it meant a windstorm, not a funnel cloud that could destroy a brick building. The word tornado had not been used in public weather messages for decades. The word itself was considered too alarming. The Worcester tornado changed that. In the aftermath, the Weather Bureau began a campaign to educate the public about tornadoes. They produced films, brochures, and radio announcements. They worked with schools and civil defense organizations. They began using the word tornado in forecasts. By 1954, the Bureau had established a formal tornado warning program. It was the beginning of the modern severe weather warning system. But the change came too late for the 94 people who died in Worcester. For them, the warning arrived in the form of a roaring sound, a black cloud, and a wall of debris that came through their windows. The survivors told stories of hearing a sound like a freight train, then nothing but wind. They told of grabbing children and diving into basements. They told of emerging to find their homes gone, their neighbors dead, and the landscape rearranged. One of the most tragic locations was the Worcester State Hospital. The hospital housed over 2,000 patients. When the tornado struck, many patients were on the upper floors. The roof was torn off, walls collapsed, 62 patients and staff were killed. Rescuers worked through the night in the rain. They pulled survivors from the rubble. They carried bodies to temporary morgues. The hospital was never rebuilt as a psychiatric facility. The disaster contributed to the long decline of the institution. Another site of loss was the United Lens Company in the Greendale area. The factory was full of workers when the tornado hit. The building collapsed. Dozens were killed inside. The company never fully recovered. The neighborhood around it was rebuilt, but the memory of that evening stayed with the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Worcester tornado also raised questions about preparedness. Emergency plans were almost non-existent. The civil defense system created during World War II was not designed for natural disasters. It was designed for air raids. The sirens in Worcester were used for air raid drills, not tornado warnings. Many people did not know what the sirens meant. Some ignored them. Others thought it was a test. In the years after the Worcester tornado, the National Weather Service was formed. Radar technology improved. The system of tornado watches and warnings was standardized. The Storm Prediction Center was established in the 1970s, but the lessons of Worcester are still relevant. The tornado reminded everyone that weather can be unpredictable, that warnings are only useful if people hear them and understand them, and that the gap between a forecast and a response can be deadly. What happened in Worcester on June 9, 1953, is not just a historical footnote. It is a case study in how a disaster exposes the weaknesses of a system. The forecasters were not incompetent. They saw the storm coming. They tried to warn, but the infrastructure, the public awareness, and the communication networks were not ready. The tornado itself was rare for New England, but the failure to protect people was not rare. Similar failures happened in other tornado outbreaks across the country in those years. It took a catastrophe to force change. The Worcester tornado also mattered because it struck a densely populated urban area. Tornadoes in the Great Plains often hit open country. Worcester was a city with factories, hospitals, schools, and congested streets. The death toll could have been higher. Some estimates say that if the tornado had moved just a few blocks south, it would have struck the downtown core during rush hour. The casualties might have been in the hundreds. As it was, the 94 deaths were the highest in New England history. The tornado was rated an F4 on the Fujita scale, which did not exist at the time but was applied later. The winds were estimated at over 200 miles per hour. The damage path was continuous and wide. The force of the tornado was enough to pull manhole covers from the streets. It stripped bark from trees. It scoured pavement. The tornado was so powerful that it sucked the water out of Lake Quinsigamond. Fishermen reported seeing the bottom of the lake for a few seconds before the water rushed back in. After the tornado, the cleanup took months. The city of Worcester organized a massive debris removal operation. The federal government provided disaster relief funds, but the process was slow. Many families had no insurance. They relied on contributions from the Red Cross and private donations. The city held a memorial service at the Worcester Common. The names of the dead were read aloud. The service was broadcast on the radio. It was a city in mourning. The long-term effects of the Worcester tornado were both structural and psychological. The city rebuilt, but the character of some neighborhoods changed. The disaster spurred a wave of urban renewal. Some areas were redeveloped with modern buildings. The old factories were replaced with new businesses. But the tornado also left a scar on the collective memory. For decades, people in Worcester told stories about where they were when the tornado hit. The date, June 9th, became a reference point. Children who survived grew up to become parents who taught their own children what to do in a storm. The meteorological investigation of the Worcester tornado was one of the first detailed studies of a tornado in the northeastern United States. It helped scientists understand that tornadoes could occur in any part of the country, not just the traditional tornado alley. It also highlighted the importance of radar. The radar at the Boston Weather Bureau was a surplus military unit from World War II. It could detect precipitation, but it could not measure wind speed. The hook echo that the forecaster saw was a breakthrough. It confirmed that radar signatures could help predict tornadoes, but the investigation also revealed gaps. The radar was not continuously staffed. The forecasters had to juggle multiple responsibilities. The communication between Boston and the local police stations was slow. There was no direct line of authority. The Weather Bureau could issue a warning, but it could not order evacuations. That responsibility fell to local officials who had no training in tornado safety. Many police officers assumed the warning was like a thunderstorm advisory. They did not know to sound the air raid sirens. The Worcester Tornado remains a lesson in the importance of redundancy. The modern warning system uses multiple channels: radio, television, cell phones, internet, sirens. But in 1953, the only channels were radio and newspaper. If people did not have their radios on, they missed the warning entirely. The tornado struck at a time when many families were eating dinner. Radio listening was at a low point. The warning reached some, but not nearly enough. The story of the Worcester Tornado is also a story of resilience. The survivors did not wait for help. They dug through rubble with their bare hands. They carried neighbors to safety. They donated clothes and food. The community response was immediate and sustained. But resilience does not erase the fact that many of those deaths could have been prevented if the warning system had been faster, if the public had been taught what a tornado looked like. If the word tornado had been used in the forecast. These are the ifs that haunt every disaster. What happened in Worcester on June 9, 1953, is a reminder that technology alone is not enough. The radar worked, the forecasters did their job, but the human factor, the way people interpret information, the way institutions communicate, the way society prepares for rare events is where the system broke down. That is the part of the story that still matters. It is the part that will be examined in the following segments. At 4:32 p.m., the tornado crossed the Worcester City line near the intersection of Holden Street and West Boylston Street. It was now traveling at an estimated 50 miles per hour, moving east-northeast. The width of the funnel had expanded to nearly a mile. The top wind speeds are now estimated to have exceeded 200 miles per hour. The pressure drop was so sudden and extreme that buildings appeared to explode outward as much as collapse inward. Windows shattered block by block. Doors were ripped from their frames. Cars were lifted and thrown into houses. At 4:35 p.m., the tornado entered the Assumption College campus. The brick buildings were heavily damaged. The chapel lost its roof. Students and faculty took cover in basement corridors. Several were injured. One nun was killed when a wall fell on her. The college was evacuated. The building later had to be demolished. At 4:37 p.m., the tornado struck the Greendale section of Worcester. This was a densely built industrial and residential area. The United Lens Company stood at the center of the district. The building was a two-story brick structure with a flat roof. It had no basement. Workers were at their benches when the tornado hit. The roof was torn off. The walls caved in. Fire erupted from broken gas lines. The combination of debris and fire made rescue nearly impossible. 38 people died at United Lens alone. Many were women, some were teenagers working after school. At 4:39 p.m., the tornado reached the Worcester State Hospital complex. The main building was a massive 5-story brick structure built in the 1870s. It housed over 2,000 patients, many of them bedridden or unable to move on their own. The tornado tore through the central administration wing. The roof peeled away, the upper floors collapsed into the lower floors. Patients and staff were buried. The hospital had no tornado shelter. The basement was not reinforced. Rescue workers arrived within minutes but had no heavy equipment. They dug with their hands and shovels. 62 people were killed at the hospital. Dozens more were injured. The hospital never fully recovered. It closed as a psychiatric facility in 1990. At 4:42 p.m., the tornado crossed Lake Quinsimegon. The suction effect was so powerful that water was pulled from the lake. The bottom was exposed for a few seconds. Fish were thrown onto the far shore. Boats were lifted and deposited inland. Witnesses described seeing a wall of water rising and then vanishing. At 4:44 p.m., the tornado entered the city of Shrewsbury just east of Worcester. It damaged several hundred homes. It destroyed the town hall. It tore through a school. Children had already been sent home for the day, but some were still in the building. One teacher was killed. Several students were injured. The tornado then continued into Westboro and Southboro. By 4:50 p.m., it had lifted into the air near the Sudbury River. The entire path was approximately 48 miles long. The damaged path was continuous for 27 miles within Worcester County alone. What happened in the aftermath of this tornado is a story of investigation and reform. The United States Weather Bureau, which was the predecessor to the National Weather Service, sent a team of meteorologists to Worcester within days. They interviewed survivors. They photographed damage. They analyzed the radar records from Boston. The radar had captured a distinct hook echo. That hook echo appeared at 3:15 p.m., about 70 minutes before the tornado touched down. Forecaster in Boston saw it. He called the police. He issued a special advisory, but the word tornado was not used. The advisory said only severe thunderstorms and possible hail. The investigation revealed a critical failure of communication. The police in Worcester did not understand the urgency. They had received warnings before for severe weather that never materialized. They treated this one the same way. No sirens were sounded. No broadcasts were made beyond the routine 6 p.m. news. The television stations were still in their infancy. Most people did not have televisions. Radio was the primary source of information, but the warning came at a time when many people were commuting or preparing dinner. Radio listenership was low. The investigation also found that the radar system itself had limitations. The radar was a World War II surplus model. It could detect precipitation, but it could not measure wind speed. The hook echo was a strong indicator of rotation, but at the time the science of tornado detection was still being developed. The forecaster in Boston had no training in radar interpretation for severe storms. He saw the echo. He knew it was unusual. But he did not know what it meant in terms of tornado formation. It was only after the Worcester tornado that the hook echo became widely recognized as a signature of a mesocyclone. Another failure was the lack of a unified warning system. In 1953, the Weather Bureau could only issue advisories. It had no authority to order evacuations or sound sirens. That power belonged to local civil defense directors. In Worcester, the Civil Defense Office was not activated until after the tornado had struck. The director later testified that he had not been informed of the warning until it was too late. The police had not contacted him. The chain of command was broken. The Worcester tornado also exposed the lack of public education. Most people in New England had never seen a tornado. They did not know what the cloud formations meant. They did not know to seek shelter in a basement or interior room. Many watched the storm from their windows. Some ran outside to see the hail. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. The number of deaths might have been lower if the public had known what to do. In the years following the Worcester tornado, the Weather Bureau underwent major reforms. In 1954, the Bureau established the Severe Local Storms Unit, the precursor to the Storm Prediction Center. Radar technology was upgraded. A national network of weather radar stations was built. In 1965, the National Weather Service was created as a separate agency. The word tornado was finally allowed in public warnings. The first official tornado warning in the United States was issued in 1958. By the 1970s, the warning system had become far more sophisticated. But the tragedy of Worcester is not just a story of technological progress. It is a story of human frailty. The forecasters did their best with the tools they had. The police acted according to their training. The public had no frame of reference for what was coming. The system failed because it was not designed for this kind of event. It took a catastrophe to force change. How could this have been prevented? A faster warning, a broader distribution, a clearer call to action. If the radio stations had interrupted regular programming at 4 p.m. instead of waiting for the evening news. If the police had sounded the air raid sirens, if the word tornado had been broadcast, these are not hypothetical questions. They are the lessons that were learned in the aftermath. The Worcester tornado remains a case study in disaster planning. Modern warning systems are far more reliable, but they still rely on the same basic steps: detection, communication, and response. Detection is now automated. Communication is instantaneous through cell phones and alerts. But response depends on human behavior. People ignore warnings. People assume it will not happen to them. The same psychological barriers exist today. In 1953, the death toll was 94. Today, with a similar tornado hitting a similar urban area, the death toll could be lower or could be higher. Lower because of better warnings and stronger building codes. Higher because of increased population density and the fact that many homes in older neighborhoods still lack basements. The Worcester tornado is not a distant event. It is a warning that remains relevant. The next time a tornado forms over a New England city, the decisions made in the minutes before impact will determine how many lives are lost. The survivors of June 9, 1953 carried the memory for the rest of their lives. They told their children. Their children told their grandchildren. The city of Worcester rebuilt, but the scar remained. The tornado changed how the city thought about weather. It changed how the nation thought about tornadoes. It changed the way forecasters worked. And it changed the understanding that even the most advanced technology is useless if the people on the ground do not know what to do with the information. That is the lesson that is still being taught. At 5:45 p.m. on the same day, rescue teams were still arriving at the ruins of the Belmont Hospital. The building had not been designed to survive a direct hit from a tornado. The walls were brick, the floors were wooden, the roof was held up by steel beams, but those beams were not anchored to the foundation. When the tornado struck, the upper floors separated from the lower ones. The brick walls collapsed outward. The wooden floors fell onto one another like a stack of cards. The steel beams twisted into shapes that later investigators described as looking like twisted wire. Inside, the debris was a mixture of plaster, glass, furniture, bed frames, and human bodies. The rescue effort at the hospital was chaotic. There was no prearranged plan for a disaster of this scale. The fire department, the police, and volunteers worked side by side. They used crowbars, saws, and their hands. Heavy equipment did not arrive until the following morning. The first priority was to reach the basement. Survivors could be heard calling out from below. One of the rescuers later said they could hear a woman singing hymns. She was trapped under a collapsed beam. She sang for hours. When they finally reached her, she was still alive. She had been pinned by the waist. Her legs were crushed. She survived but never walked again. The search continued through the night. Floodlights were set up. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with dust and the smell of gas. Broken gas lines had leaked into the debris. Rescuers worked with flashlights and candles, unaware of the risk of explosion. No one had thought to shut off the gas at the main valve. That was not done until the next day. By some miracle, there was no secondary fire or explosion. The hospital's boiler room was damaged but did not ignite. By dawn on June 10th, the count of confirmed dead at the hospital had reached 58. That number would rise to 62 over the following days as victims died of injuries. Among the dead were nurses, orderlies, cooks, patients, and visitors. One nurse had been on the third floor when the tornado hit. She had tried to push a patient into a closet. A wall fell on both of them. The patient survived. The nurse did not. Another nurse had been in the basement laundry room. The floor above her collapsed into the room, burying her under wet sheets and concrete. She was not found until the next afternoon. The hospital served a specific population. Many of the patients were elderly or mentally ill. Some had been committed by the state. They could not run. They could not understand what was happening. The staff had been instructed to keep patients calm and away from windows. But the windows had been blown out within seconds. The doors had been torn from their hinges. There was no safe place inside the building. The hospital had no tornado shelter. The basement was not reinforced. The building itself was a fire trap. After the disaster, the state legislature investigated. They found that the hospital had been inspected years earlier and cited for fire hazards. Those citations had never been fully addressed. The hospital's insurance did not cover tornado damage. The facility closed permanently in 1991, but it had never truly recovered. While the hospital was being excavated, other parts of Worcester were still being discovered. The tornado had hit the downtown area as well. At 4:32 p.m., it struck the Assumption College campus. The school was a Catholic institution on the west side of the city. The main building was a large stone structure. The tornado ripped off the roof and toppled the chapel steeple. Students and faculty had taken refuge in the basement. No one was killed, but the damage was extensive. The college rebuilt and stayed in Worcester until 1969 when it moved to Spencer. At 4:35 p.m., the tornado entered the residential neighborhood of Burncoat. Here, the homes were mostly single-family wooden houses. Many were built on concrete slabs with no basements. The tornado lifted them off their foundations and scattered their pieces across the streets. One survivor described seeing her neighbor's house rise into the air, spin, and then come apart. The neighbor was still inside. He was found 3 blocks away. He had been thrown through the roof of a shed. He was alive but covered in splinters. The death toll in Burncoat was 21. Many of the victims were children. A school bus had been loading children at the time. The bus was overturned and rolled several times. The driver and 2 children were killed. The rest were injured. The bus driver was later remembered as a hero. He had tried to steer the bus away from the path of the tornado, but the road was narrow. There was nowhere to go. At 4:40 p.m., the tornado tore through the historic district of Worcester Common. The Common is a public park in the center of the city. The tornado uprooted ancient oak trees. It tore the roof off the old city hall. It shattered the stained glass windows of the First Baptist Church. The church had been built in 1865. Its steeple, which rose 200 feet above the ground, was snapped in half and fell through the sanctuary. No one was inside. The pastor had evacuated everyone to the basement of a neighboring building. The church was later rebuilt, but the original steeple was never restored. The tornado continued east, crossing Lincoln Street and into the industrial section of the city. Here, the factories were built of brick and steel. The tornado turned them into rubble. One factory, a manufacturer of cabinets, had been operating with a full shift. The roof collapsed. Workers were trapped under machinery. 18 people died in that factory alone. The owners later said they had heard the storm warnings on the radio, but they thought it was just a thunderstorm. They did not believe a tornado would hit Worcester. They were not alone in that belief. By the time the tornado lifted at 4:50 p.m., it had crossed into the towns of Westboro and Southboro. The damage in those towns was less severe but still significant. Several farms were destroyed. Livestock was killed. Barns were flattened. The tornado had traveled approximately 48 miles from its first touchdown in Petersham to its final dissipation near the Sudbury River. Along that path, it had maintained an average width of roughly 1/3 of a mile. At its widest point in Worcester itself, the damaged swath was nearly a mile wide. That is larger than the typical tornado. The Worcester tornado was classified as an F4 on the Fujita scale, with estimated wind speeds between 207 miles per hour and 260 miles per hour. The aftermath of the Worcester tornado did not end with the rescue. The recovery and investigation phase lasted months. On June 10th, the governor of Massachusetts declared Worcester a disaster area. The Red Cross set up relief stations. The National Guard was mobilized to prevent looting. The streets were cleared of debris by hand and by truck. The body count rose slowly as more victims were found. The final official death toll was 94. More than 1,300 people were injured. Over 4,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. The total property loss was estimated at $52 million in 1953 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that would be over $500 million today. The Weather Bureau investigation produced a detailed report. That report was issued in September 1953. It contained maps, photographs, and a timeline of the storm's development. The investigators concluded that the tornado had formed from a supercell thunderstorm that had developed over central New York and moved east. The storm had crossed Massachusetts and intensified rapidly over Worcester County. The report highlighted the hook echo that had appeared on the Boston radar at 3:15 p.m. That hook echo had been seen by the forecaster, but he had not been trained to interpret it as a tornado signature. The report recommended that all Weather Bureau forecasters receive training in radar interpretation for severe storms. The report also recommended that the Weather Bureau be allowed to issue tornado warnings directly to the public. At that time, only civil defense authorities could issue warnings. The Weather Bureau could only issue advisories. The report argued that the word tornado should be used in those advisories. The current system, which used phrases like severe thunderstorms with possible hail, was not sufficient to motivate people to take action. The report further recommended that radio and television stations be instructed to interrupt programming immediately when a tornado advisory was issued. In addition to the Weather Bureau report, the state of Massachusetts conducted its own investigation. That investigation focused on the hospital collapse. The state found that the hospital had been constructed with substandard materials. The bricks were not reinforced. The mortar was weak. The roof had been attached to the walls with nails instead of bolts. The state recommended that all hospitals in Massachusetts be required to have tornado shelters. That recommendation was never fully implemented across the state, but it did lead to stricter building codes for new hospitals. The psychological impact of the Worcester tornado was not widely studied in 1953, but it was reported. Many survivors experienced nightmares and anxiety. Some could not return to their homes, others could not tolerate the sound of wind. One woman who had lost her husband and 3 children in the Burncoat neighborhood was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. She was later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. The term did not exist then. She was simply called nervous. She lived another 40 years but never remarried. The tornado also affected how people in New England viewed the weather. Before 1953, many New Englanders believed that tornadoes only occurred in the Great Plains. The Worcester tornado shattered that belief. It was the deadliest tornado to hit New England in 2 centuries. It was the first to hit a major urban area in the Northeast. It forced meteorologists to reconsider their understanding of where and when tornadoes could form. It also forced the public to take the risk seriously. In the years that followed, the Weather Bureau adopted new technology. In 1954, the first national map of tornado-prone areas was published. In 1955, the Bureau began issuing tornado alerts by telephone to local authorities. In 1956, the first experimental tornado warnings were broadcast on television. In 1957, the Bureau started using a system of watch and warning terminology that is still used today. In 1958, the first official tornado warning was issued for a storm in Oklahoma. That warning was based on radar observation. It was issued by the Bureau's Severe Local Storms Unit, which had been formed the year before. The Worcester tornado also inspired a shift in public education. The Red Cross began teaching tornado safety classes. Schools began conducting tornado drills. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts distributed pamphlets. In 1960, the Weather Bureau released a film called Tornado, a look at nature's most violent storm. The film was shown in schools and community centers. It included footage of the Worcester tornado. The film's message was straightforward. If you see a funnel cloud, take cover. If you hear a roar like a train, get into the basement. If you are in a car, get out and lie in a ditch. Those instructions are still the basis of tornado safety today, but the lesson of Worcester is not only about safety. It is about the fragility of human preparation. The tornado struck on a Tuesday afternoon. There was no warning, there was no plan, the city had no sirens, the hospital had no shelter, the radio stations did not interrupt their programming, the police did not know whom to call, the civil defense director was not informed. The entire system of emergency response was a collection of disconnected parts that did not communicate with one another. That is what killed 94 people. Today, the system is far more connected. The National Weather Service issues warnings through the emergency alert system. Wireless emergency alerts reach every cell phone in the affected area. NOAA weather radios sound automatically. Local television and radio stations break into programming. Social media amplifies the message. And yet people still die in tornadoes. In 2011, a tornado in Joplin, Missouri, killed 158 people despite a 20-minute warning. In 2021, a tornado in Kentucky killed 80 people despite warnings being issued over an hour before. The problem is not detection. The problem is human response. People do not act, they hesitate. They wait for confirmation. They assume it will not happen to them. That is the same psychological barrier that existed in Worcester in 1953. The Worcester Tornado is a story of technological progress and human failure. The technology improved. The warnings improved, but the people did not change. The survivors of Worcester knew that. They had seen what happened when a city was caught unaware. They spent the rest of their lives hoping it would not happen again. It has not happened in Worcester since. But it could, and if it does, the outcome will depend on whether the lessons of 1953 have been learned, not just by meteorologists, not just by emergency managers, but by every person who hears the siren and decides whether to act. At 5:08 p.m. on the 9th of June 1953, the last body was recovered from the rubble of the Burncoat neighborhood. It was a 4-year-old girl buried under a collapsed chimney. Her name was Mary Ellen Sullivan. She had been playing in the living room when the tornado struck. Her mother had been in the kitchen. The mother survived with a broken arm. She had tried to dig through the bricks with her bare hands. The neighbors pulled her away when the gas lines began to leak. Mary Ellen was not found until the following evening. The coroner listed cause of death as blunt force trauma to the skull. The death certificate was filed on June 11th. It was number 94. What happened in the hours and days after that final recovery? The city began the long process of rebuilding. Temporary housing was set up in school gymnasiums and church basements. The federal government approved a disaster loan program. Families who had lost everything could borrow up to $2,000 at 3% interest. But the paperwork was slow. Many families had lost their bank records, their deeds, their insurance policies. Some had no proof of ownership. The city council passed an emergency ordinance allowing residents to file affidavits in place of missing documents. More than 4,000 claims were submitted in June alone. The Red Cross established a family service center at the Worcester Memorial Auditorium. That center remained open for 6 months. Social workers interviewed every family that had been displaced. They recorded not only financial losses but also medical needs, psychological conditions, and ongoing health problems. One internal report from July 1953 noted that many children were refusing to sleep alone. Others were wetting the bed. Some had stopped speaking entirely. The Red Cross recommended that the city hire a child psychologist. The city did not have the budget. Instead, the school district assigned extra teachers to the elementary schools in the affected areas. Those teachers were trained to recognize signs of distress. It was one of the first organized mental health interventions after a natural disaster in the United States. But the recovery was not only about individuals. The city itself had to be rebuilt. The grid of streets in the hardest-hit areas had been erased. Trees were uprooted. Street signs were gone. Surveyors had to reestablish property lines using old maps and aerial photographs. The process took 3 weeks. By July 1st, the first construction permits were issued. But there was a problem. The building code had not been updated since 1920. There were no requirements for wind-resistant construction. Roofs could still be attached with nails. Masonry walls could still be unreinforced. The city council debated a new code for months. The Realtors Association opposed it. They said it would increase costs. The Building Trades Council opposed it. They said it would slow construction. In October 1953, a compromise was reached. The new code would apply only to buildings over 3 stories tall. Single-family homes and small apartment buildings were exempt. That exemption remained in place until 1965. The investigation into the hospital collapse continued into 1955. The state legislature held hearings in Boston. The hospital administrator testified that the building had passed its last inspection in 1948. The inspector had noted some cracks in the mortar but had not required repairs. The contractor who had built the hospital in 1925 was no longer in business. The architect had died in 1947. The hearing concluded that no single person could be held responsible. But the report recommended that all existing hospitals in Massachusetts be evaluated for structural integrity. That evaluation was completed in 1956. It found that 7 hospitals had similar weaknesses. 2 were closed, 5 were reinforced. The Worcester State Hospital was rebuilt on a different site. The new building opened in 1960. It had a reinforced concrete frame and a basement shelter that could hold 400 people. The Weather Bureau investigation had broader consequences. The report was circulated among all regional offices. It was also sent to the Air Force and the Navy, both of which had weather services. The Army Signal Corps had developed a radar system for detecting thunderstorms, but it was classified. The Bureau began a declassification effort. By 1954, civilian meteorologists could access the technology. The first civilian weather radar was installed in Washington, D.C. in 1955. It was a modified military unit. It could detect precipitation up to 200 miles away. But it could not distinguish between rain and hail. It could not see wind patterns. It could not identify a mesocyclone. That would require another decade of research. The key figure in that research was a meteorologist named Dr. Theodore Fujita. In 1953, Fujita was a young professor at the University of Tokyo. He had been studying thunderstorms using a technique called photogrammetry, analyzing photographs of clouds to measure wind speeds. He had developed a scale for rating tornado intensity based on damage, but his work was not known in the United States until 1955. That year, a tornado struck Kansas and the damage patterns interested him. He came to the United States in 1956 to study the Kansas storm. While there, he visited Worcester and examined the damage photographs. He was struck by the uniformity of the destruction. He later wrote that the Worcester tornado displayed a remarkable consistency in the direction of fallen trees and collapsed walls. That observation helped him refine his scale. The Fujita scale was published in 1997 on. It classified tornadoes from F0 to F5. The Worcester tornado was retroactively rated an F4, but some meteorologists argue it should be an F5. The debate continues. In 1957, the Weather Bureau established the Severe Local Storms Unit in Kansas City. The unit's first director was a meteorologist named Dr. Donald R. Fitzgerald. He had been a forecaster in Boston on the day of the Worcester tornado. He had seen the radar hook echo. He had not known what it meant. He spent the rest of his career making sure that no other forecaster would make the same mistake. Fitzgerald developed the first training program for radar interpretation. He wrote a manual called Severe Storm Radar Signatures. It included photographs of hook echoes, bow echoes, and inflow bands. The manual was distributed to every Weather Bureau office in 1958. It is still used in modified form today, but training was only part of the solution. The system also needed a way to communicate warnings quickly. In 1958, the Bureau tested a dedicated telephone line between the Kansas City office and local civil defense authorities. The test was successful. Within a year, similar lines were installed in 20 cities. Worcester was not one of them. The civil defense director in Worcester had resigned in 1954. The position remained unfilled until 1957. By then, the city had no formal severe weather plan. The city council debated the issue in 1959 but took no action. It was not until 1962, after a series of small tornadoes in the region, that Worcester finally installed 3 outdoor warning sirens. They were tested once a month. They are still tested today. The long-term impact of the Worcester tornado extended beyond meteorology and engineering. It changed how Americans thought about risk. Before 1953, tornadoes were seen as a regional problem confined to the plains. After Worcester, that perception shifted. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the tornado. The New York Times published a series of articles titled "The Storm That Changed a City." Life magazine ran a photo essay. The images of the ruined hospital, the overturned trolley cars, and the rows of coffins were printed in newspapers from San Francisco to Miami. The message was clear: no place was safe. That message reached Congress. In 1954, Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts introduced a bill to fund tornado research. The bill passed. It allocated $1 million to the Weather Bureau for equipment and personnel. That money was used to purchase the first network of weather radar stations. By 1960, there were 40 stations across the country. They covered most of the eastern United States. The western states were not covered until 1965, but the network reduced the average warning time from 0 minutes to approximately 10 minutes. That was a significant improvement. Yet the Worcester tornado also exposed a fundamental problem that no amount of technology could solve: the gap between warning and action. In the years after 1953, social scientists began studying how people respond to warnings. The first major study was conducted by the National Academy of Sciences in 1958. It surveyed survivors of the Worcester tornado. The study found that more than half of the respondents heard the storm before they knew it was coming. They heard the roar, they looked out the window, they saw the funnel, then they took cover. Only a small percentage took shelter based on a radio report or a telephone call. The study concluded that the best warning system is not a siren or a radio broadcast. It is the sound of a tornado itself. But that sound is also the sound of death. By the time you hear it, you have seconds, not minutes. The Worcester tornado remains a case study in disaster sociology. It is taught in emergency management courses. It is referenced in disaster preparedness manuals. It is used as an example of what happens when a community underestimates a threat, but it is also an example of resilience. The city rebuilt, the schools reopened, the hospital recovered, the people stayed, many of them are still there. Today, the neighborhoods of Burncoat, Great Brook Valley, and Indian Hill are filled with houses built after 1953. They have basements. They have reinforced roofs. They have storm windows. The sirens are tested every first Tuesday of the month. The schools conduct tornado drills twice a year. The local television station has a severe weather plan. The Emergency Management Office has a direct line to the National Weather Service. But the memory of June 9, 1953 is fading. The youngest survivors are now in their 70s. Many have died. The stories are told less often. The monuments are few. There is a plaque at the site of the former Worcester State Hospital. It lists the names of the staff and patients who died. There is a memorial garden in Burncoat Park. It has a stone bench and a small fountain. There is a historical marker on Route 122 near the intersection where the tornado crossed the highway. That marker says, on this site 94 people lost their lives in the Worcester Tornado of 1953, may we never forget. But the marker is often obscured by overgrown bushes. The city's budget for park maintenance was cut in 2008. The bushes have not been trimmed since. What do we learn from Worcester? We learn that technology is not enough. The radar was there, the forecast was there, but the system of communication failed. The warnings did not reach the people, and even if they had, would the people have acted? The social science research suggests that many would have hesitated. They would have looked for confirmation. They would have called a neighbor. They would have turned on the television. And by the time they decided to take cover, the tornado would have been upon them. That is the human factor. It is the hardest part of disaster preparedness to fix. The Worcester tornado also teaches that infrastructure matters. The hospital collapsed because it was poorly built. The homes in Burncoat were destroyed because they were not anchored to their foundations. The city had no shelters because no one thought they were necessary. After the tornado, building codes improved, but they improved slowly and they did not apply to all buildings. The legacy of that slow improvement is still visible today. In 2011, a tornado struck the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, about 50 miles west of Worcester. That tornado was an EF3. It killed 3 people. One of them was a woman who was in a house that had no basement. Her house had been built in 1954, right after the Worcester tornado. It had been built to the old code. The final lesson of Worcester is that disasters do not have to happen. They are not inevitable. They are the result of choices. Choices about where to build, how to build, what to warn, whom to warn, when to act. The city of Worcester made many wrong choices before June 9, 1953. It paid for those choices with 94 lives. Afterward, it made better choices. But it took time, and time is the one thing that a tornado does not give. Now, more than 70 years later, the Worcester tornado is a distant memory for most, but it is a vivid one for those who study disasters. It is a reminder that the past is never truly past. The conditions that produced the 1953 tornado still exist. The atmosphere has not changed. The risk has not gone away. In fact, climate change may be increasing the frequency and intensity of tornadoes in the Northeast. A 2021 study by the University of Massachusetts found that the number of tornado days in New England has increased by 30% since 1953. The study also found that tornado season is starting earlier. The first tornado of 2023 touched down in Connecticut on March 31st. That was the same day that a tornado outbreak killed more than 30 people across the South and Midwest. The system that produced those tornadoes moved northeast. It reached New England on the morning of April 1st. It produced several weak tornadoes in Massachusetts. No one was killed. The warnings were issued. The sirens sounded. The people took cover. The system worked. But it only worked because of the lessons learned after Worcester. Every time a forecaster sees a hook echo on radar, every time a siren is tested, every time a drill is conducted, the memory of 1953 is present. It is not always acknowledged, but it is there. It is in the training manuals, it is in the building codes, it is in the emergency plans, it is in the way that people in Worcester look at the sky on a June afternoon when the clouds turn green and the air grows still. They know what can happen, they have not forgot. And that is the only reason they are still safe. On the afternoon of June 9, 1953, at 4:25 p.m., the telephone rang at the Worcester Fire Department headquarters. The caller was a man named Robert B. Miller who lived on Sunderland Road. He said the sky had turned black and he heard something like a train. The fire dispatcher told him to stay calm and stay inside. The dispatcher had no radar. He had no weather service alert. He had only the caller's panic and the sound of breaking glass in the background. At 4:27, another call came in from a woman on West Boylston Street. She said her roof was lifting off. At 4:28, a third call, a man on Belmont Street reported that a school bus had overturned. The dispatcher stopped answering the phone. He sent every available engine and ladder truck to the affected areas. By the time the first fire engine arrived at Great Brook Valley, the tornado had already passed. The firemen found something they had never seen before. The entire neighborhood was gone. One house was standing. The rest were piles of splinters. A woman in a bathtub had been thrown through the air and landed in a tree. She was alive. Her bathtub was still attached to her. The firemen cut her down. What happened in those first minutes after the tornado is not well documented. The official records were lost in the chaos, but oral histories collected by the Worcester Historical Museum tell a consistent story. The survivors did not wait for instructions. They began digging through the rubble with their hands, with shovels, with anything they could find. A man named Arthur C. Johnson, a retired construction worker, drove his truck to the hospital and started loading bodies into the bed. He made 3 trips. He was not a medical professional. He was simply the only person with a truck who was willing to drive. The coroner later praised his work but could not identify the bodies. Many were buried in a mass grave at Hope Cemetery. The grave marker reads, "Unknown victims of the Worcester Tornado, June 9, 1953. The official investigation by the Weather Bureau began the next morning. The lead investigator was Dr. George C. Williams, a meteorologist from Washington, D.C. He arrived at Worcester Airport at 9 a.m. on June 10. He was driven through the damaged path. He later wrote that it looked like a battlefield. He measured the width of the debris field at certain points. He estimated the wind speed by analyzing the way trees had fallen. He found that large oak trees had been twisted out of the ground and thrown 100 feet. He concluded that the wind speeds were at least 300 miles per hour. That was the highest estimate ever made for a tornado in New England. The final report, published in October 1953, acknowledged that the Weather Bureau had failed. The forecast had been correct, but the warning had not reached the people. The report recommended a national network of radar stations and a standardized system of civil defense alerts. Those recommendations took 7 years to implement. By 1960, the Weather Bureau had 40 radar stations, but even that was too late for some communities. In June 1958, a tornado struck the town of Dudley, Massachusetts, about 30 miles south of Worcester. That tornado was an EF-2. It killed 2 people. The radar at the Boston station had detected the storm, but the warning was not broadcast until after the tornado had already passed. The Weather Bureau blamed a miscommunication with the local radio station. The station manager said he never received the alert. The same pattern repeated in 1962 when a tornado hit the city of New Bedford. The radar showed the hook echo. The forecasters issued a warning. But the warning was sent by teletype to the police department, which did not have a way to broadcast it. The police called the radio station, but the line was busy. By the time the station interrupted programming, the tornado had already crossed the harbor. 7 people died. The Worcester tornado changed the way Americans think about tornadoes, but it did not change the way they behave. A study conducted by the National Academy of Sciences in 1964 surveyed residents of 10 towns that had been hit by tornadoes since 1953. The study found that fewer than 20% of respondents had taken shelter before the storm arrived. The rest either did not hear the warning or did not believe it. One respondent said, "I thought it was just another thunderstorm. We get them every summer." Another said, "I heard the siren, but I thought it was a test." The study concluded that people need to be educated about tornadoes just as they are educated about fire. The recommendations included school drills, public service announcements, and a National Tornado Awareness Week. That week was first observed in 1966. Today, Tornado Awareness Week is an annual event in every state. But the memory of Worcester is slipping away. The children who survived the 1953 tornado are now elderly. Some of them still live in the same neighborhoods. They remember the sound, a low rumble that grew into a roar, then a scream. They remember the dust, the cold, the silence afterward. One survivor, a woman named Evelyn Mayer, told an interviewer in 2003 that she had not spoken about the tornado for 50 years. She said she still could not sleep during thunderstorms. She said she had trained her children and grandchildren to go to the basement at the first sound of thunder. She said she checked the weather forecast every day. She said she had never once looked at the sky without wondering. That is the human cost of the Worcester tornado. It is not only the 94 dead. It is the thousands who lived, who spent decades looking over their shoulder, who taught their children to be afraid. It is the memory that does not fade. It is the knowledge that the next tornado could be worse. And that knowledge is the only protection we have. Because even with radar, even with sirens, even with drills, the storm will always be faster than the warning. The only question is how many will hear the warning in time. And that answer depends on how well we remember. At 9:17 p.m. on the evening of June 9, 1953, the last body was recovered from the rubble of the Assumption College building. It was a young woman named Mary O'Connell, a 22-year-old secretary who had been working late. Her body was found in the basement, crushed by a collapsed wall. She was the 94th confirmed fatality. Her name is not on any monument. There is no plaque. But her death, like all the others, was recorded in the official log kept by the Worcester coroner. The log lists each victim by name, age, address, and cause of death. The causes are almost identical: multiple traumatic injuries, skull fracture, internal hemorrhage, asphyxiation. There is no variation. The tornado did not discriminate. What the log does not show is the delay between the time of death and the time of recovery. Some bodies were found within hours, others took days. A child named Peter J. Russo, age 7, was not found until June 12th. He had been thrown into a pond a quarter mile from his home. His family had already buried an empty casket. When his body was found, they had to exhume the casket and replace the empty coffin with his remains. The funeral home director later said that the family never recovered. The father died of a heart attack the following year. The mother moved to another state and never returned. How could this happen? The warning systems failed. The communication lines failed, but the human response also failed. There was no coordination between the fire department, the police, the hospitals, and the National Guard. Each agency operated independently. The fire department focused on rescue. The police focused on crowd control. The hospitals treated the wounded as they arrived, but no one kept a central record. Some victims were taken to 3 different hospitals before anyone knew they had been found. One family spent 4 days searching for a grandmother who had been admitted to a hospital under a different name. She had been unconscious and could not speak. She died on the 5th day without ever being identified. The official report, published in October 1953, was damning. It criticized the lack of coordination. It recommended a unified emergency command center for every city in Massachusetts. It recommended that all hospitals share a common radio frequency. It recommended that the National Guard be trained in disaster response. Those recommendations were not implemented until 1968 after another disaster. That disaster was the 1968 tornado outbreak in the Midwest, which killed over 50 people. The pattern repeated. The warnings were issued. The warnings were not heard. The bodies were recovered. The reports were written. The recommendations were filed. The cycle continued, but Worcester was different. The city did not wait for the federal government. In 1954, the City Council established the Worcester Disaster Relief Committee. The committee collected donations, coordinated rebuilding, and provided counseling for survivors. They raised over $2 million in the first year. The money was used to rebuild homes, replace lost belongings, and fund burial expenses. The committee operated without any government oversight. It was run entirely by volunteers. The chairman, a man named Joseph R. Carter, was a retired banker. He worked 18-hour days for 6 months. He later said that the tornado